Hello, Pentax Tips here, and today we will be talking about the exposure triangle in photography. The exposure triangle is one of the basics in photography, and these principles can be used across any camera brand and format. Photography is all about capturing light. More light creates a brighter image, and less light a darker one. If you're using vintage cameras, sunlight catalyzes a reaction on a sensitive chemical sheet called film. For digital cameras, the photoelectric effect is used to measure the number of photons that hit tiny pixels on what's called a sensor. It might seem subtle, but the brightness of an image is very important for conveying the proper mood, feel, and detail. Minute exposure adjustments can be seen by the discerning eye, and more substantial changes in exposure can significantly change the entire narrative of your image. Exposure is measured in stops. A stop is a doubling or halving of a relative brightness level. For example, to say, increase the exposure by 1 stop would mean to increase the brightness twice as much. The exposure triangle is a quick reference guide and allows us to explain how to achieve a brighter or darker image and the trade-offs or consequences those choices make on the image. It is composed of 3 variables at each corner, along with the most common stop values used along each side for quick reference. The 3 elements of the exposure triangle are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. First, light is captured and focused by lens elements and filtered through the lens aperture, which is the opening similar to our iris around the pupil. Next, the remaining light enters the camera and passes through the shutter, which is the curtain protecting the film or sensor. The last variable used to be called ASA in the film era, but is now called ISO in the digital era. I will continue calling this variable ISO, but know that it also applies equally to ASA. ISO is the standardized rating for the gain of the sensor, or a quick and easy way to think about it is the sensitivity of the sensor to light. As previously mentioned, choosing which variables you'll use to properly expose your image will have significant trade-offs that affect your image qualities. Let's start with shutter speed. As mentioned, the shutter is the curtain protecting the sensor, and the amount of time the curtain is open is called the shutter speed. It is expressed in fractions of a second or full seconds for long exposures. Longer shutter speeds create a brighter image, while short speeds darken the image. The trade-offs being, a slow speed of, say, half a second will show motion blur for anything that was moving in the image during the exposure. A fast speed of about 1/250th of a second will freeze the image and not show motion blur as easily. Next, let's talk about ISO. ISO is the gain or sensitivity of the sensor to light. ISO is supposed to be an international rating. However, there are significant variations not only between, but within brands. Just remember that lower numbers like ISO 100 will produce darker images, while higher sensitivities like ISO 3200 will produce brighter images. The trade-offs with ISO are that low ISOs create a very clean image without noticeable grain, while a high ISO will produce a lot of grain and is often called a noisy image. Last, the aperture setting specifies how big or small the hole opening will be during the exposure. A more open aperture will let more light pass through the sensor, making a brighter image. Shutting the aperture down to smaller sizes will filter out available light, causing a darker image. Aperture values are expressed as a ratio of focal length to hole diameter, with a relatively large aperture hole being around f1.8 and a small aperture being f22. Aperture values are expressed on a reverse scale similar to wire gauge. The trade-offs with aperture isn't the most intuitive of the exposure triangle variables, and so left for last. It controls the depth of field. The depth of field is the distance of acceptable focus on either side of the focal plane. Basically, a narrow aperture allows for both the foreground and background of your image to be in focus, while wider apertures create a shallow depth of field, isolating focus on just the subject with the foreground and background displaying what's called bokeh or focus blur. Now, let's run through 3 quick examples of real-life scenarios. Say you are shooting an action shot, such as your kids running around, birds in flight, or anything moving, and you want to freeze the action. If you have too slow of a shutter speed, moving objects will show motion blur during the exposure. Also, having a high shutter speed will not allow a lot of light into the camera, which makes a darker image. Therefore, you can open your aperture to allow more light to enter the lens, increase the sensor ISO, or both. But remember, there are image trade-offs that come with adjusting the other two variables. Now you can see the game in photography is beginning to take shape. Your choice on one variable over the other is part of the photographer's personal expression. For our second example, you're shooting a portrait. A general theory in photography is to remove distracting objects and have the model be the sole focus point. When you open the lens aperture, the depth of field becomes more narrow, removing distractions from the foreground and background with focus blur called bokeh. However, your aperture will let in a lot of light, likely making your image too bright if left uncompensated for. Therefore, you need to speed up that shutter to reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor, or decrease the sensor ISO. Again, remember that your decisions will come with trade-offs. For our last example, we are viewing our images, either in the back LCD while taking photos or in post-production, and we notice that the image is too grainy or noisy. This is the trade-off that came with using a higher ISO. To produce a cleaner image, you can reduce the sensor ISO. However, having a lower ISO setting on the sensor equates to darker images, and you'll have to seek your light from the aperture or shutter. These were only 3 examples, but there are many different scenarios where you would choose one of the exposure triangle variables over another. And just by how much and which variable you choose is part of the image acquisition fun. We suggest sitting down with your camera, finding out how to modify these variables, and going out shooting to test them for yourself. Please share this video with your photography friends and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Pentax photography content.